Sean, generally in times of war, defence spending goes up for obvious reasons. And suddenly we've got Ukraine and Russia with wider threats. We've got Israel, Hamas, Gaza. We've now got the Houthis supporting, but also we're getting drawn into it. The possibility that Iran is behind it and it's a proxy war for them. The Defence Select Committee meeting, is this going to be a gin and tonic party, or do you think they're going to actually get down to business this time?
Well, the House Comms and Defence Committee has just released a report, 4th of February, called Are We Ready for War? And they've sort of concluded, no, we're not. And I should make clear, there was a lot of stuff in the media about this that was trying to sensationalise it. Because, of course, we're not ready for war, it said. You've also got former President Trump saying we're on the brink of World War III. And you've also got General Sanders, head of the British Army, saying we need to go to conscription to bring people in if we were going to war. All of which has really scared people. And the harsh reality is that we're not on the verge of World War III. We can examine that a bit in a moment. But the harsh reality is the House Comms Defence Committee was looking at is the provision of our military, how much money we spend on it, what it's got, what its readiness is it suitable for today's threat environment? Because they were very, very complimentary about the military themselves. They said they always do more than they're funded to do, and that's one of the problems. The one big issue they said is that for every 8 people leaving, only 5 are joining, which is creating a manpower issue for the services. And I know firsthand from colleagues who are in the military, particularly I know that some Air Force outfits, particularly the Typhoon Force, are running white hot at the moment. And I know the boys and girls serving there are loving it. They love serving their country. They love being out at the front line. But when you're running white hot, they get burnt out. And all that means is they leave earlier than the service would have expected them to.
And wanted them to.
And that means that, and if for every one guy who leaves before his time, you turn the tap on to get a replacement in. But even if they join the service today, you've at least 5 years before that individual jumps on the front line.
And it takes a long time to grow a general. In my business, if you lose your chief executive, you can hire a new one.
Yes.
You can't just go out and hire a general.
No, because there's so much experience and expertise in there. But it's more, I think, particularly for a lot of the senior officers, you can, sometimes fresh blood is useful. But when you're looking at specific skill sets, whether it's in the Navy, the Army, or the Air Force, for the Air Force particularly, it's a really long training time for pilots. These are complicated pieces of equipment. And therefore, keeping people, and for a few years, when the pandemic was running, for example, the airlines practically shut down. There were no routes for pilots outside, so people coming back into the service, we didn't have a problem. Now, the airlines are recruiting like mad. They've stopped the training schools for ages. They're desperately trying to get pilots in from the military. So are some of our Middle East partners are also trying to attract people, and that means there's a pull. Now, you can't replace flying a military jet. I mean, it's just something special. But if you start to weary of it because you're running white hot, and that's what the House of Commons Defence Committee was saying. So
if you would look into your crystal ball, what do you think the outcome? So I guess in the extreme, the context might be that the post-war, post-Second World War arms race, again, driven by the uncertainty that war creates, people like Russia and America are on 15% of their GDP, just a horrendous amount of money on defence. Obviously, the nuclear race was part of that. Everything's calmed down now, and the US is 4%, Russia 4%, Poland 4%, UK 2%. What do you think? What do you think is going to happen?
One of the challenges, I think, and we're going to explore this, I think, over the coming weeks and months with the general election this year. There's a lot of talk politically about 2% is not enough. The Conservatives are talking about we aspire to 2.5%. But in the same breath, the Defence Secretary Grant Shapps says it's a more dangerous world than we've had in our lifetime. When Margaret Thatcher was last in that post, it was 4%. of our GDP spent on defence. So it feels from a military perspective is that talk is cheap. Ultimately, if you genuinely believe it's a more dangerous world, if you don't match that with resources, I mean, vision without funding is hallucination. It's one thing having the words, but unless it's backed up by money, and I'm a pragmatist at heart. You know, we live in a country which has got a huge overdraft. We need the NHS, we need everything else. But the number one priority of any government is to protect its nation. And I think it's really interesting, the political language around this. House Commons Defence Committee, that report is a sort of pan MPs group. It's not a particular Conservative, Labour or otherwise. What it is doing though is providing a sort of a method by which some of these politicians can bang the drum a bit. And so it's one thing to say our military is not ready. What are you going to do about it?
So over the coming weeks and months then, with an election looming, we're going to hold those who talk and those who do, the military, maybe hold them to account and see exactly what their different policies are when they're scrutinised and put under the microscope, because the difference between 2% and 4% is a lot of money. And where are you going to steal it from? Very difficult to put taxes up. We're living into the highest tax burden we have in decades. What are you going to do? You're going to we've just announced, or they're just about to announce, that the pension age will go to 71. All of a sudden, that's not good news. Where's the money going to come from? It's going to be difficult politically, isn't it?
It's going to be very difficult politically, and that's why I don't think we're trying to be mischievous about it. We're just, as taxpayers, saying, okay, it's one thing to say this, but are you sincere about it? I think what's fascinating as well is part of this goes back to what is our role in the world. When I was in the Ministry of Defence, the way that you build your defence budget effectively is you look at military tasks. So the government says, military task 1, defend this island. The MOD looks at ways to do that, whether it's through air, land or maritime, comes up with a suite of options. The government chooses how it wants to do that, and that is what's provisioned. So, for example, in the air, we have 24/7 cover for typhoons, providing quick reaction alert anywhere in the country. And likewise, our Navy and Army colleagues have high readiness forces ready to go. But when you look at the other military tasks, some of them we're looking at threats around the world and deciding what contribution we would need to be prepared to make to a NATO force in response to a particular scenario. That might be a large land footprint, large number of soldiers, it might be a large naval footprint, it might be a large air footprint. Then there's a question of concurrency. Would that situation over there and this one happen at the same time? In which case, clearly, you need more resources, or are we going to assume they're not concurrent? Thirdly, you've got to look at how long that commitment would be. Is it a go in, do the job, come out again, or is it enduring? All of those things create a set of assumptions, and upon those assumptions are based how many ships, tanks and aeroplanes you need, how big your armed forces are. The danger is obviously you get used, rarely do actual military operations marry the assumptions, and therefore you generally, the politicians say, right, we need your military to do that. Our leadership are one of the many failings, which is a good thing and a bad thing, is their can do and therefore do it. So we're always doing more in the military than their provision for. But I think it's back to what's our place in the world. Can we really afford to be taking big bets with our military around the world when we don't pay for it? And that's a really difficult one for our government to wrestle with, because ultimately we are a small island nation. We aspire to be bigger, more influential on the world stage than maybe our size permits. But if we want to maintain doing that, you've got to spend the money. And that's part of the challenge.
Yeah. Well, I don't feel sorry for them when we say it's tough. That's their job. I was going to say that's what they get paid the big bucks for, but actually they don't get paid big bucks, do they? Actually. So this is one we're going to follow then, and if we can, we're going to get things under the microscope, as we've said, and get these guys to own up to what they're really going to do.
But I think we're also going to look at quite closely at the individual services as well, and include my former service, the Royal Air Force, because as a taxpayer, you want to make sure that the money is being spent wisely. And I think there's several examples we can look at about it with the benefit of hindsight, easy to say, but what are the lessons we should learn for the future? And particularly, let's give a couple of examples. The war in Ukraine and the Houthi attacks are all based on drones. There's been a massive escalation in the use of drones, and looking at where's the threat from drones? What are we doing to combat that? I noticed in the news yesterday there were these remote six-wheeled unmanned little vehicles that were doing delivery rounds. If we're getting used to that, it wouldn't be hard to pack explosives into those. So what are we doing to protect ourselves from this growing threat, which favours the underdog because our conventional military is big ships, big tanks, big aeroplanes, established army, navy and air force. Whereas these drones could be bought off the internet, many of them. It's not difficult to arm them. They're not going to blow up something big, but my goodness, could they cause a lot of problems. And the other thing, just to pick up as well, is that I think we also need to scrape away the rhetoric. Are we on the verge of World War III? Russia has had its fingers badly burnt in Ukraine. It's lost 300,000 soldiers, 200,000 to injury, 100,000 potentially killed, over 2,000 of its main battle tanks. It is in no fit state to invade further into Europe or take on NATO. So whilst it's horrible what's happened in Ukraine, bizarrely, it's less of a threat now than it was. Likewise, the Houthis are being badly mauled, and although the strikes against them are unlikely to deter, we'll come on to that in a minute. It's not exactly the brink of World War III, and I think we've got to be careful in an election year, particularly US presidential election year. My grey hairs, your lack of hair is all about, we've seen some of this before, and I think we've got to be a bit more measured about how we approach the threats out there.
So money's tight. There's an election coming up in the UK and indeed in the US. The scrutiny from the general public on what we spend on everything is going to be pretty fierce. From a defence point of view, things have got, on the one hand, more expensive. We know it takes 8 years to train a pilot. At that point, they leave with L plates before they become, proficient. Artificial intelligence is all around us. Every company has to consider it, including defence. One view is that actually planes in the future will be flown by computers, won't need pilots, and therefore the RAF becomes an admin force, not a fighting force.
Yeah, there's no doubt that the whole advent of AI and particularly just technology basically is changing the nature of warfare. I mean, warfare is inherently a human condition. Unmanned air vehicles have been around since before manned vehicles, yet the technology that's gone into manned vehicles, it's got lighter and whatever, has meant that actually more and more now unmanned vehicles are being used. And there's always been a clamour, does that mean the end of manned aircraft? Well, it might be. It might well be. If you've ever watched the film Terminator, are we one day going to be in a world where there are, automated robots that are fighting the wars on the ground? We're already seeing mini ships operating autonomously against Russian ships. We're seeing mini unmanned air vehicles being used not only by the Ukrainians and the Russians, but also by the Houthis, and also by the attacks on the American troops out in the north of Jordan. I think there's an inevitable progress, but the use of technology in warfare is nothing new. I mean, the battlefields, people used to line up at dawn, amass, get ready, and then just go at each other on the battlefield. Then somebody invented the bow and arrow, and that was originally thought as cheating because it was no longer man against man, warrior, gladiator. It was killing people at distance. That was seen as dishonourable. Then, guns came around, then machine guns. And so the tools of war have constantly evolved, and I have no doubt they will continue to do so. But ultimately, unless AI and machines are running the world, it will still be a human condition to decide whether to use military means to achieve political ends, and therefore it will still ultimately be a human condition.
But we've all seen the films with a 20-year-old technician sitting in a well-equipped digital office somewhere in the Californian desert, guiding a drone that's about to drop a bomb. Now, behind that 20-year-old is a lieutenant colonel or an air commodore deciding whether it's right to press the button or not. But that's a very different war from the wars we used to fight.
It is and it isn't. As somebody who has been at the tip of the sword and flying in bad guys' territory, and also been at the sort of back end watching as these long-range unmanned vehicles are controlled from a distance. One thing that drones are very good at is doing reconnaissance, long, enduring reconnaissance, where you don't really want to have a bloke in the cockpit for 20 hours. It's really uncomfortable, and there's all sorts of other issues about going to the bathroom and refreshments and etc. So those sorts of operations, long-range surveillance, are really suited. As soon as you get into delivering bombs, so far, the Brits have been known as what's called courageous restraint, which sometimes somebody's asking for a bomb to be delivered, but you don't deliver it because it just doesn't feel right. You're not quite sure. You know where your friendlies are. You can see where the enemy are. But are you sure that your bombs are not going to cause damage to your friendly forces? And sometimes the sense you're hearing the voice, that note of tension in the voice of the guy who's asking for help. And there's been all sorts of issues over the time. You might remember that in the headlines several years ago, utterly useless. And that was the Royal Air Force failing to deliver a bomb when an army person on the ground was pleading for them to deliver a bomb. But it subsequently came out that actually it was not clear from the Air Force person involved moving around at 600 miles an hour exactly where the friendlies and the enemies were. And the risk was, if a bomb had been delivered, it might have killed some of our own people on the ground. As it was, none of our friendlies were killed. It didn't half stir emotions, but when you are dealing with human life, I got very close aboard to an unmanned air vehicle that wasn't in the right height block that it was meant to be when it was being flown out of America.
I mean, I think the reality, I could be wrong, is that the technology just accelerates at such a pace. There isn't an issue, and I say this, theoretically, slightly tongue-in-cheek, but as a technologist, we will say there's not an issue that we can't solve. So all the practical things you've just described that are risks, we can overcome. And I can almost guarantee you that Mark Zuckerberg is sitting in his office right now with somebody saying, I can design a system that is totally foolproof. You won't need people, there won't be any blood. We'll still win the battle.
Yeah, and I'm confident you're right in a way, but how many times with high-tech technology do you have a problem with your computer, or you have to reboot it to get it going again, or a bit of tech that suddenly doesn't respond well because the internet's dropped out or a satellite's dropped out or something like that? And the danger is, if you have the man in the loop, traditionally has been really resilient to any of those electronic things, whereas as soon as you're relying on a computer to do it, there are inherent vulnerabilities to that, not least of which we're currently developing directed energy weapons in this country, high-powered lasers that are specifically designed to take the brains out of unmanned vehicles and to fry electrical circuits. So actually, and a laser costs about 10p a shot to fire. So do we really want to put all our eggs in that basket to then suddenly find that we're vulnerable? I'm not sure. And the danger is I'll always sound protective because I'm like a Luddite because I used to fly jets. I'm absolutely not. I'm confident that those in the MOD are looking at this through a really harsh objective lens. But you've got to be really careful here that we don't end up making a decision that is, we understand that the cost but not the value.
So let's quickly do the sums then. Let's say it takes a fighter pilot 10 years to become proficient. That's a lot of money. A Typhoon, how much?
Depends what the maths is. Call it 100 million for cash.
Okay, let's call it 110 million for the whole thing. Put one of these things in there. That's 110 million. How much is the drone?
Well, it depends. You can get the little handheld ones for pennies, but we look at some of the ones that are being used in Ukraine and by the Houthis, probably 50,000, 100,000 pound a drone.
Yeah, that's quite a bit different from 110 million. And a laser shot is 10p. I mean, it's pretty obvious which way it's going.
No, it is. And again, but do you have a military for show, as what's happening with the Houthis at the moment? I think one of their missiles has got through, but it's got through and hit a merchant ship that was not protected, and it's quite difficult. So I've got to think we've got to be quite careful to identify these. Most of these drones travel 100 miles an hour. They're not that capable. They don't have any defensive aids on them. They are pretty vulnerable to being shot down. But it's a bit like in Israel with the Iron Dome system. You fire enough stuff at them, some will get through. And that's always...
quantity is quality.
Yeah, quantity has a quality all of its own sometimes in this. But I think we've got to be careful not to learn the wrong lessons out of that. Ultimately, drones have huge limitations. They can't carry a big payload. They can carry a hand grenade, which is pretty bad news for you and I, but it's not going to do strategic damage.
No.
But as part of a capability, incredibly capable.
Yeah. I suppose sitting here in our Spitfire armchairs.
Very nice Spitfire armchairs as well.
It's pretty easy. It's not so easy if you're right in the middle trying to work out what the answer is.
Yeah, and also it's making sure we're not vulnerable. It's not putting all your eggs in one basket. And I think the military, particularly around dual use, and we're hoping to do a bit more work with some of the industries around this space to look at how advances in technology around space travel and just the reducing weight, higher performance of a lot of this capability, how that's being used. And often we're not hearing about it from the military perspective because it's secret or well above that level. Yeah. But I'm confident by my time in MOD, there's some very clever people putting this stuff to use. And a lot of it is specifically looking to counter other people doing exactly what you're suggesting. So whilst those technologies and the counter technologies are out there, I think there's an enduring theme here that ultimately the manned option, whether it's on the battlefield, in a ship or in an aircraft, has a lot more resilience at the moment than a artificial intelligence and technology.
So we've got a new extremist, terrorist organisation has sprung up from nowhere in terms of the general public. Now, pretty much everybody has heard the term Houthi or Houthi, as the Americans call them. I refer to them as a ragbag bunch of thugs, but actually, in many ways, they've done a lot of damage, and we've been dragged into a war with our planes and the Americans with their, missiles. But they're not deterred. In fact, they're emboldened, Sean. So what's our strategy going forward?
It's fascinating, isn't it? I mean, at the start of this, I guess the West had little choice but to do something because the Houthis were attacking merchant shipping and military shipping in the Red Sea, particularly off the Bab al-Mandab Straits, that narrow bit of the straits at the bottom of the Red Sea. That's caused a lot of merchant shipping to reroute. That's added 10 days to 14 days to transit time, added a lot of cost. Now, to you and I, a little bit on the loaf of bread doesn't make a great deal of difference, but for a lot of people, that is a huge difference. And therefore, could the West allow that to pass without making sure the arterial network of shipping was opened? The challenge, of course, is that the West has now been bombing the Houthis, and many are asking, well, you haven't destroyed it. And we've got dragged into a war, a bit like Israel trying to destroy Hamas, saying, you can't destroy an ideology. How are we going to destroy the Houthis? And I think that's a question that's been dominating a lot of the headlines, is that once you start bombing, where does it end? Now, from my military perspective, first of all, I don't think there was any intention to destroy the Houthis. Initially, all these responses are trying to be measured. They're trying to make sure that nobody wants an escalation. So the first response is to deter. In other words, you hit a few missiles that are in the open, you hit a few launchers, and it makes clear to the Houthis our resolve. Continue, we can get you, we've got the determination to get you, and we've got the technology to get you. Did that work? No. So the next phase, which you've heard Grant Shapps using this word, degrade, that's the next, and it's almost an end-to-end targeting. Not only the missile system, the missile launcher, the missiles themselves, if they're stored underground, the radar systems, the command and control systems. In other words, the full end-to-end, but still trying to avoid targeting people.
And what have we achieved so far, do you think?
Well, tellingly, I think we've not heard of any launches of anti-ship missiles, cruise missiles or ballistic missiles. I suspect that's because they rely on a radar, as soon as a radar pops up, satellites, ships, everybody can see that. And if you've got if you've got an enduring military presence, particularly fighter jets around the region, as soon as they sniff that, you can throw a missile down which can home in on that radar. But
well, I was going to say, so if we've degraded that to a point where it's going to be difficult, what are they doing next, or what are they doing now?
Well, the West will probably retain the option of destroying. Now that is, so it deter, degrade, then destroy. All of a sudden now that's all the military capability. So that's not just equipment, that's also leadership, and it's also military personnel. Now to date they've avoided doing that. I'm not suggesting they will do that, but that is the next escalatory option. Because it's one thing having intent, it's quite another having the equipment to actually do anything if you intend to. I think the challenge for the West, though, is how do you respond? And then the second one is the Houthis, who, if they don't have the hard, expensive missiles, because you won't have too many of those anti-ship missiles are £1 million a pop. You know, you might have a few in your inventory, but you're not going to have a lot. Whereas the drones, which they have been using very effectively for a long time, and what's interesting about the drones is that the Houthis claim that they're developing their own capability. But actually, when you look into it, do you remember the Shahed 136 drones? Does that name ring a bell? That's the drones that Russia has been buying off Syria and using against the Ukrainians. Those same drones have appeared with the Houthis, that they're now using those against shipping. They've also got a little family of drones, the Samad 1, 2, 3, and we understand there's a Samad 4 as well, named after a Houthi leader that got killed, I think, about 2018. But even those, they look like they're very slightly modified Iranian drone skates.
So roughly, say, £50,000 for a drone, $1 million plus more for a missile, plus the launching, the control mechanism, all that's going to be more expensive with the missile system. So you can get a lot of drones for the same money. And you were mentioning just before we went on air the New Year's light shows with the drones, how frightening that can be if applied to a military situation.
Yeah, I think one of the things that you're absolutely right. I mean, you can get a lot more drones bang for your buck. But let's also put in context that a ballistic missile is quite difficult to shoot down. You know, it's going at several times the speed of sound. It's quite difficult to target. It normally carries quite a big payload, big explosive charge. Whereas a lot of the drones, even their latest generation of drones is about 120 miles an hour. They are not self-protected. They don't carry any electronic warfare, self-defense mechanisms, so they're very vulnerable to getting shot down just by simple lying on your back with a gun in the air and firing at them.
But you scared me earlier with the light show analogy, because I don't know how many hundred, but let's say there's 500,000 drones all working in concert. You then applied that to a military or a terrorist situation.
That's the worry, I think, is that quantity has a quality all of its own, and so a bit like in Israel, where they've got the Iron Dome system, Hamas has just worked out if you can shoot down 30 rockets at a time, so we're going to fire 300 at you, some will get through. Likewise with drones, if you overmatch, the worry for me is, and this is where the technology is going, is people love watching the light show at New Year's Eve, potentially 20,000 little drones all flying beautiful patterns and changing those patterns. But
talking to each other.
And talking to each other and completely coordinated. Now you imagine I, as a military guy, put a hand grenade under each of those drones and now sequence those to fly, for example, into Wembley Stadium at an international football match. Just imagine the carnage that will be caused by that. The whole advent of the way that drone technology is going is, I think, incredibly worrying. Yes, there's lots of technology out there to protect, but the rate of technology advance, particularly by the Ukrainians, and now we're seeing with the Houthis, they've got a lot of soldiers, but they don't have an army, navy, or air force, yet they're still able to terrorize military shipping and merchant shipping.
There's no manual, there's no person, there's no trainer back at home keeping the person doing it up to date. It's all done with the technology. pretty scary, I think.
It is, and that's one of the reasons why I think we're going to explore over the next few weeks, trying to get inside the heads of some of the companies in this country, which I know are working at some of the technology, and not only in the commercial space, because there's a huge escalation in the number of drones being used potentially for delivering parcels. They're coming into our lives, but how do you protect yourself against those who might see us ill?
Yeah.
And there's a lot of work being done there. A lot of it's secret, but I'm sure that we'll be able to explore some of the areas where we'll see some great British ingenuity and smart minds having a look at this.
We're not going to stop talking about the hostages and their plight. And as some of the hostages that have been rescued are telling their stories, we're learning more. If I was a father or mother or brother or sister of a hostage taken from my family, and I was given the choice of continuing the war or stopping the war and getting my relative back, obviously my hand's going to go up for getting my relative back. It's an absolutely terrible situation for everybody to be in. What are we beginning to learn now? Further evidence is coming out, Sean.
And it's a horrendous part of the story about the Israel, war with Hamas. We're now, as we record today, it's the 7th of February, which is 4 months to the day since Hamas did those dreadful atrocities and took 240 hostages along the way. Now, some have been released. A lot of the civilians have been released, women and children. Some have been killed. We've heard recently that up to 30 more hostages apparently have been killed. Who knows the propaganda, whether it was Hamas killing them or the results of the Israelis. We've also learned that some of these hostages were being kept in people's homes, but literally only the other day we saw footage. Some journalists were allowed into Gaza, heavily escorted by the IDF, we should say. So it's very managed what they were allowed to see. But some of the underground tunnels are quite claustrophobic, but they open up into big open areas, and they showed an area underground which had bars. And they've done DNA testing that shows that this was a place where some of the hostages were being held. And I think the worry here is that whilst Prime Minister Netanyahu seems utterly focused on destroying Hamas, his two objectives, he said, was also securing the release of the hostages. And to date, the only way the hostages have got out is through some sort of pause in the fighting, because bluntly, more have been killed during the fighting than have been released. And as you say, the amount of protests in Tel Aviv have been ramping up. As the population Israelis are going, more needs to be done. And I think one of our concerns around these hostages is that they'll never be forgotten, but what are they going through? Civilians sound like the stories that we're getting back are they weren't badly treated, but how are the military going to fare? And I think one of the things, there's very little experience upon which we can draw here, but one person that we both know who's been through a hostage situation, a guy called Flight Lieutenant John Peters, who in the Gulf War 30 years ago, he was shot down. He was incarcerated by the Iraqis, given a pretty brutal time at the time. He didn't know when he was going to get out. He thought at times he was going to die. He wasn't sure he'd ever get out. But his mental resilience, and it wasn't just about when he was incarcerated, it was also, he talks about when he was finally released. And that's going to happen for the Israeli hostage. We hope that some will be released. So we were very lucky to spend some time with John Peters. It is a unique insight into what must be incredibly harrowing. And this is what John Peters had to say.
You're flying your Tornado jet at very low levels on a mission into Iraq, and suddenly your day went wrong. Can we start the story there?
Yes, I was involved in 1991, 17th of January, first day of the first Gulf War. We were attacking a dispersed operating base, Ramallah Southwest. We went in for attack. It was a low-level attack, so our attack run was about 20 feet or so. We were doing about 550, 600 knots, so that's 600 plus knots, miles an hour. Went to the target, shot at the whole way in by guns and missiles, anti-aircraft. Came off, we failed on that mission. Our bombs didn't come off for various reasons. Came off the target, we were on our way home, and a surface-to-air missile went up our right-hand engine, exploded, took out the fly-by-wire system. And then anti-aircraft guns hit my right-hand wing, hit the Sidewinder missile. It ignited the rocket propellant, and a 4-meter torch of flame shot out the front of the wing. So I'm now flying in a mechanical mode rather than through computer controls, because the control surfaces have been shot with the aircraft, became a ball of flame, trying to solve the problems. And then it was going no further, so we ejected into the desert. 2 hours on the ground, and eventually about 25 soldiers found us, buried us in the sand by machine gun fire, captured, and the officer, long story short, said, "Please talk to us or we'll take you to the nasty people in Iraq, in Baghdad." So we said nothing, and we were taken to the nasty people in Baghdad. Secondly, I was trained, as you say, in conduct after capture. And the lead up to war, because Kuwait was invaded 8th of August, we were training to go to war literally the day after. And so in that progression, first of all, I'd spent 10 years in the military training to go to war. Secondly, that it's accelerated, and it includes discussions about what would happen if. And so the difference between someone in the military and someone not in the military is one is trained in a progress that actually you've already set your mind prior. Now, I know many Israeli people most have gone through some sort of military training, because that's how their nation works. But if you are not in the military, in a uniform, the difference in psychological, emotional, etc., shock when an incident happens. I mean, it's shocking when you're in the military, make no mistake. But I had already set my mind what if, and had thought through those circumstances. But when you're in a concert or a festival playing music, you do not expect to be subjected to AK-47s, which is a very specific sound, and extreme violence, and then with the capture. So they'll have that shock that they have to come to terms with. And I do believe it will be different between military and civilian people. I sat there going, I know what's going to happen to me. I'm either going to be killed and die violently here, or I'm going to disappear in the Middle East for 10 years. I had seen all the prisoner of war movies when I was younger, and known about the Vietnam POWs, and I said, Midnight Express, for instance, the guy who famous movie. And so for 10 hours, I just set my mind, I will not come out a damaged human being. If I survive this and I come out in 10 years' time, you can pull my teeth out, you can cut my balls off, and you can break my legs. If I survive, I will not come out a damaged human being. So I had, sounds rather obscene really, I had 10 hours to set my mind. I basically said, I'm going to lock myself in, whatever you do, I'm going to lock myself into myself. Because I refused to be damaged, I suppose. But I was pretty much anticipating what was going to happen to me. You get released, and the moment you are pushed out of the coach, when they moved us from the prison to the hotel in Baghdad, which was before they drove us through for the full release. Yes, you go, how I describe it now, you go from black box, so you're in a concrete box, completely isolated alone, to white light. You cannot see anything because there's so many flash bulbs going off, so many lights, and you are literally, and you realise you've gone from complete isolation to, actually, as subsequently I realised, global attention. And that's 29 who talks to me now at 61. That was shocking. You're pleased to be out, but you have to deal with, you very rapidly, or in every newspaper, shocking. Being in the military, every bloody senior officer that ever existed comes to see you. Weird. Everyone's your friend. You are a political football. And that is far more challenging on the return. And the fact that you can't go to a pub, you can't walk down the street without literally people hugging you and crying, men and women. And I returned to 25,000 letters. They were coming in at 1,500 a week from people who've been abused, people who've been raped, and you realise your whole landscape has changed.
A lot of people died that day. Was there any sense of that sort of guilt that you survived and others didn't? Was there, there are just so many conflicts and emotions that were going to be
There's conflicts. I get the fact I survived, but it makes me sound rather unemotional. But when you're aircrew, I lost about 12 friends within a couple of years of leaving flying training because they flew into the ground. And as you know, I cried at the first funeral, really tearful at the second, third. I had damp eyes, fourth. I know you get attuned to a funeral. It's the nature of our role that we played. And you've got that psychological construct. You don't ever think it's going to be you. So you get catapulted, and in some ways you don't have enough emotional bandwidth to deal with sorting out, coming to terms with an experience, plus how every friend is suddenly contact you. And then you've got literally the globe. When I say the globe, people in the UK and people in the military used to take the mickey out of it, and I'm the easiest target. But for all the mickey taking, all the bars, every single aircrew that was vehement in taking the mickey would individually come up to me almost in tears and give me a hug. Air marshals crying on their shots. They're a 55-year-old man crying in your arms. And you've got that rank difference. So that's what I'm saying. People look at the gloss of the attention of TV and radio, but it's not just in the Britain, Daily Mail, Sky TV. You're talking, it's Hungarian, French, German, American, Australian. There are hundreds of this, all with cameras, all with wanting to know this. Who are you? What are you about? At the same time as balancing off, reintroducing Helen and I, our relationship again, because effectively, it's almost like going out on a first date again, as you start to explore how's your life been in this black hole we've both been on. Because I have 2 children. I didn't see Tony until she was 4 months old. So there's this, yes, you try and deal with, it is so complex trying to just balance off, how to balance off your parents, how everyone speaks to you.
The Israelis, they don't know if their hostage is going to come out alive. And I think, as you said, for a lot of it, it's as tough, if not harder, for those outside, because they are, feeling sorry for you, and that sounds patronising, but you know what I mean, but also without knowing how you're managing. And I think that's my final sort of point on this is, what message would you have for those families of the Israeli military hostages there who are worried sick, sleepless nights?
I think there is a message, because how do you tell a parent they've lost their son or daughter? And for all the solace they have to deal with that level of grief. For the individuals who are in captivity, they will find their own route out when they return, whether they're fated or vilified in the press. The press is the press is the press. They just want a story. And they will push and push to find some sense of a story when, and I'm a product of the media, I'm not negative towards the media, but en masse, that can have an adverse effect. God willing that they come out alive, will come to terms in their own way with their experience. You'll have a couple who will do media. There will be the vast majority, I'd imagine, who will just want to go back to the wonderful thing called normal life.
John, we've mentioned for 40 years, it's always humbling, genuinely humbling to hear you talk about it, so thank you very much indeed for your time.
Right.